Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session on compensation. My name is Kristin Wood, Director of Programs for the Start and Scale Group at Communitech. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to review. So today's session is being recorded. You should have received a notification upon entry to the session. So we post all of our past Ask Me Anything sessions on our website at communitech.ca and use them as a resource for companies to refer back to at a later date. We also ask that you please keep your microphone on mute for the duration of today's session, and please use the chat functionality to ask any questions that you have. So we're planning an open panel discussion for today, so we really encourage you to ask any and all questions that you have related to compensation. That will really help to guide today's discussion and make sure that you're walking away with all of your questions answered. Today's session is meant to provide general guidance. If you would like to have a follow-up conversation with any of our panelists, please reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, and we're happy to get you connected. Here's a brief glance at some of our upcoming Ask Me Anything sessions. So next Tuesday, looking at Brexit and the UK trade deals and their impact on Canadian business, how to determine your company's valuation, how to improve the maternity leave process for your employees, and lastly, how to protect your business from business assets from a cyber attack. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. So we have Jessica Good, an HR consultant, Kristin Condon from Sales Talent Agency, and Suzanne Harrison from Benchmark. So three experts when it comes to compensation, and I'm looking forward to diving into today's session. So let me just stop sharing my screen here. So to kick things off, I'll have each of our panelists give a brief introduction to themselves and a little bit about their background, and then we'll dig into some questions. Jessica, can you kick us off?
My name is Jessica Good, and I'm happy to be here to discuss one of my favorite HR topics, compensation. So I've been working in compensation for well over a decade. As well, not only have I been working in compensation, I've also been teaching compensation, conducting research in compensation at York University as part of my PhD. I've had experience in design and delivery of international based pay ranges, bonus plans, sales compensation design, and equity programs at global multinational organizations and small startups as they scale up to and beyond IPO. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions today. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Jessica. Kristin, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Kristin Condon. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Sales Talent Agency. I'm one of the partners, and from my perspective, our compensation expertise comes with working with hundreds and hundreds of clients and hundreds of candidates, and helping both sides in terms of putting together what's an optimal compensation plan for an individual or for a specific position across North America. Small businesses looking to create their very first sales role or compensation model, to assisting large organizations and helping understand how to be competitive from a compensation perspective and all of the elements that go into that. So that's what I'm happy to help contribute to today.
Thanks, Kristin. And last but not least, Suzanne. Suzanne, are you on mute or did we lose you?
I don't see her.
Okay, I can't believe I just did this after 13 months of being on Zoom, so I'll start over. I was on mute. I'm a partner at Benchmark. We run the Tech Survey, and I believe some of you actually participate in our Tech Edge survey, which is basically geared to the tech industry in Ontario. And what's exciting, and we'll talk about those regional differences, is we're actually going to branch out onto the West Coast as well and provide their salaries. So that's an interesting part. So I'm going to be talking about compensation in terms of what we're seeing with the data, what we're seeing with the HR programs, and also what we're seeing anecdotally with some of our clients as we help them develop those compensation systems and programs, especially from the point where they reach the critical mass, where they need a program, they need a system, they need a structure.
Great. Thank you to all three of you for being here today and sharing your knowledge with our audience. So to get things started, I think we'll just start off with the basics and look at what are some of the important things to consider when putting a compensation package together. So right from being an early stage startup and bringing on your first roles to being a scale up and bringing on some senior roles, what are some important key initial things to consider? Somebody want to, I guess, Suzanne, do you want to maybe kick us off since you were the last to speak?
Sure. I'll kick you off. So I think the basics is kind of try to get the basics right. And the basics are different for when you talk about a startup versus a scale up. At the startup phase, the basics right is really getting, it's not necessarily cash, it's really the right fit to be able to work within your tiny little team. And you're going to have more of a looser structure where the potential for ownership will play a greater role than it will later on. And what we've seen in our data when we look at, stock options, who offers this, I would say it's almost 97% of those small startups offer that potential for equity ownership at a future date. And as the company grows, that tends to lessen up. As you scale up, in terms of it's time to look at what are other companies doing in terms of those skills that you need to bring from the outside. That's when organizations have to look beyond of just their founders, look beyond of going, what is going out there? What do people need? Yes, people need cash compensation, but if I'm luring someone from another organization, I'm going to have to look at all of a sudden my benefit offerings. What can I do there? What are the must-haves to bring people up there? So that's just at the scale up. So it's get the basics right. And I'll talk about this a bit later, and allow yourself some flexibility in your compensation plan. Don't make it too rigid at the beginning.
Jessica or Kristin, anything you would want to add to that when companies are thinking about, what are those important key aspects to consider?
Yeah, I can add. So I think a couple of things, at least from a sales perspective, is you have to also understand, what is the behavior you're looking to drive, right? So if you're looking for someone to come in and help grow your business and, develop business from scratch, then, that commission model needs to drive and incent that behavior. And so it's really important to understand what the expectation is. Is it realistic in terms of the quotas that you've set up, the sales cycle, the deal size, things like that, so that you can really articulate very clearly to a salesperson, this is how I'm prepared to pay you should you deliver on these results. So that's very important. And then other aspects that go along with the job. So in terms of car, in terms of obviously now we all have home offices. So anything that's related to ensuring that, your employee has the right tools to do their job effectively. Obviously, equity was touched upon, benefits. And then what does benefits look like today? I think that, that's evolved significantly in the last year, especially when you think of things like mental health benefits as an example, vacation. So there's important factors there as well. And I think most importantly is, especially if you're a startup where you have the flexibility in terms of what you're putting together from a compensation perspective versus a very large global organization that has very set specific levels and tiers within their comp model. Then you have an opportunity to really dive into and want to understand what is motivating and what is important to that individual that you're looking to hire, and then ideally align that to it, because then you'll have a higher stickiness rate from that perspective.
Great. Jess, anything you want to add from your perspective?
I think, Susan and Kristin, cover a lot of the things. The only thing, I also think you need to think about is making sure that when you're scaling up and you're bringing more people in, you're thinking about what the equity and fairness for the people that are already in there in your organization. So, when we know that compensation can drive performance, it can drive the right behaviors, but people don't have any trust in how the decisions are being made, you lose that lever to help encourage performance. So that is something, I think people should always have in the back of their mind, is making sure that things are equitable when they're making their decisions.
Great. Kristin, I think you touched on some of this next question with respect to what elements can be included in putting together a strong compensation plan. So obviously we've heard that it goes beyond just the salary number, that there's other things to consider. Jess, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Actually, this I do a little do research as well as part of my PhD, and there's lots of different elements that you can do. And one thing that we're seeing a lot is the workplace fund. So that fun atmosphere that you have in organizations, maybe not a direct compensation element, but part of your total rewards package can help drive performance, can help encourage the right behaviors. It can help creative behaviors. It can help your general team performance. So you're looking at base pay, variable and stock options, but you can also look at some of other different elements that help form that culture that would go as well as part of the total rewards. Whether it's offering different activities for organizations, or just right now we're not in the office, so you won't be able to give everybody a food when they're in the office. But those are some other elements that you can think of.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that is, pre-COVID, a lot of startups, we call them like the sexy startup, and a lot of those companies or those tech companies, they offered, things in-house, like, foosball tables or free lunches or unlimited Red Bull, whatever you want to call it. And so all of that, a lot of that has been eliminated. And so it's important for a business to understand, how do you factor that change in? So again, I think, surveying your current employee population, understanding like what's important to them today, because that would have changed as well. I think the opportunity to work, when we think of work flexibility, what does that look like? It used to be like, oh, you can work from home for a day or two. And now it's like, okay, take an hour in the middle of the day to go for your walk, or help school your children online, whatever it may be. So I think it's important to just come to kind of the current day situation and having a real understanding of what that looks like and being prepared for that to evolve. You can't get too stuck in, we don't know what it's going to look like in 6 months and 12 months. And so I think understanding that there can be some evolution to that as well will help you stay competitive.
I'll just add, I think you, Kirsten and Jessica added, I just want to build on two things. One is that level of trust, that employees trust that you're doing the right things. And in terms of those strong compensation plans, we have a lot of clients are saying, well, I want to do a variable plan. I want to do a bonus plan. I don't want to just have base pay. I want to incentivize people for the right things. And with sales, it seems to be a little bit easier because there's firm metrics. Mm-hmm. But if you are going that way, make sure that the objectives are measurable and it's something that employees can trust, mm-hmm. and trust the process, that it's going to be fair. And I think a lot of companies start off saying, we want to do this. And then they get stuck and they're saying, but we don't know how to do it well. So if you're going to do it, make sure you do it well and you have really key metrics and people understand and trust the process. I think that's a big thing. The other thing that we've heard from some people who are not having employees go back to the office, they're hearing back from their employees saying, hey, you're not paying for bricks and mortars anymore. You don't have a lease. There's extra cash there. What are you going to do for me? So it's kind of to be able, it's the same thing with that trust, right? Is the employees are trusting that you're going to be able to take care of them in a different way, because things are never going to go back to being the same thing.
I think actually just to add to that is, to echo your point, is that it really comes down to transparency, right? Because I think that, to your point, a lot of employees can say, oh, we're all working from home. Therefore, you aren't paying for the office. You aren't paying for electricity. You aren't paying for these things. But a lot of businesses have been stuck in those leases, right? They have, we as our business, we just had signed on to a 5-year lease right before COVID happened. We aren't getting out of that lease. So I think it's also just explaining all aspects to your employees so that the resentment doesn't get, or misunderstanding doesn't get built up. So I think transparency, in addition to trust, helps create that trust as well, is very, very important.
That's great insights. So obviously we've already started touching on a number of things that can be included in a compensation plan outside of salaries. What are some of the most important things to consider outside of salaries?
I think,
or what strategies, if I was a company putting together a compensation plan, what would I start with? Where would I start? Would I start with salary numbers and then build onto that? Like, what strategies would I use to kind of attack putting together a compensation plan for the first time?
I think a lot of it depends on where you are. What as Suzanne talked about before, is it really depends. If you are, 5-10 people just starting out compared to when you're scaling up. Usually, I think, trying to figure out how you're going to measure items becomes more difficult. You need to be able to measure items if you're going to be able to come up with a variable or your sales commission plan. So, making sure that you have a good base pay structure is foundational. Not only is making sure your base pay is, if you are a startup, you don't have, big coffers. So using options is a great way to start. And then you start building from there. That's sort of, my perspective on how you go. You start with the fundamentals, and then, you can have a little bit more fun. And, if you don't have as much, you can add some of those, some well-being, or some, maybe you have a virtual nights for fun activities, or, there's lots of different elements, but the fundamentals are where I would start.
Suzanne, does Benchmark have any data available to companies to give kind of that fundamental base salary amounts on kind of directing companies on where to start?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So we have our positions, and then what we do is we segment the market by small companies and large companies. Now the segmented is over 50 million or less than 50 million. So the smalls are still somewhat, they're not. But I think it's still important for organizations to get the basics right, to understand the market. Even though you're not even close to paying market rate and you are lagging, it's understanding by how much. And then where's the delta? And then you look at your employees and you're going, what matters most for these employees? And when I say build flexibility, is build flexibility in terms of that delta, because your base salaries are going to be the starting point, and then you build on there where you can allow some flexibility. So it's always good to know exactly where you're finding your people, where will people leave, so you have an idea of what's going on around you. So it's best to know, not to depress you, but to be able to give you the tools to build something more robust. And I always tell people, when you think about designing a compensation system, think of growth and sustainability. You don't want to revisit this model all the time. You want to make sure that you're designing it to allow itself to grow for employee growth, but also your organizational growth. It will make sense. And you can start out very small with some parameters and leave flexibility there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
I think too, like one thing to add as well is we find that a lot of startups, we get a lot of, new business owners that reach out that are looking to hire a salesperson, and they've been responsible for sales and looking, for someone to kind of take that on for them as they are, focused on other aspects of their business. And a lot of new business owners will look at, okay, I'm just going to pay 100% commission, and straight commission. I've got this great commission model, but there's, a lot of people are not going, especially in today's market where there's a lot of hesitancy to move just based off the year that we've had. But even pre-COVID, I mean, salary, when starting off with the salary part of the compensation plan, that is the investment that you're prepared to make that person. You're not typically going to get ROI on that person for a year. And so you've got to be prepared. That's what's really important, that you're making the right decision when you hire somebody, and reducing your risk as much as possible. Just like on the other side, the candidate is also responsible for, really investigating to make sure, because they're investing as well. And they're typically, especially if they're coming from a sales perspective, they're, leaving their book of business to kind of start a new book of business. And so it's going to take them some time to ramp up. So you have to factor all those things in. And so a really, the only two people are going to take 100% commission sales role. It's people who can't get anything else, or people who are really the very, very best at what they do. And that means your 100% commission model has to be very, very incentivizing. So I think it's really important to look at, base salary needs to be the strong foundation to that relationship, and it needs to be your investment into that individual, and then adding on additional pieces like the commission structure and the bonus structure, equity, benefits, car allowance, things like that to round out that package. One thing also from a sales perspective, we have a tool on our website. It's called the Live Salary Tool. And it's data that shows the last 100 hires made with specific criteria that you've selected. So in a specific market at a specific level. And so you can see very, very clearly the last 100 people that were hired at that salary, so that you can understand kind of the competitiveness for that individual at that role in that market.
That's super helpful. Could you put the link to that in the chat perhaps, or maybe we can send it out after the session?
Yeah, I can put it in the chat.
Suzanne, I wanted to touch on what are some ways that companies can optimize a low salary budget? So if I don't have a large budget, how can I really optimize that?
So, and I think this happened, I think most organizations are in this position. So I would say, number one, don't do a peanut butter, what we call a peanut butter approach is spread it out evenly across everyone. You're going to basically, what I would recommend is really do an impact analysis with every employee in terms of reviewing where they are on their comp ratio, where they are vis-a-vis the middle of the range or the middle of the market. And then what's really are your pay drivers in the organization, right? Is it performance? Is it contribution? Where they are on their learning curve? And also looking at the impact of the resignation of that person on the organization's scarcity of skills. So what you're looking at your employees, and you're almost doing a mini evaluation of the impact of that employee resigning and what's the cost. And then you're looking at, with my limited budget, where do I allocate those dollars? And so we've worked with organizations, and basically we've done this where we've said, okay, you're going to rate everybody a 1, 2, or 3. Either they're a minimal impact, a significant impact, or a critical impact. Critical impact is you're going to have problems delivering on your strategic priorities. This person leaving will have a significant impact of you meeting your bottom line. So guess what? Those salary dollars, if this person's out of whack, out of range, out of market, they should probably go there first. So you start ranking your employees. It's a very quick and dirty way of doing it, especially for organizations who are small and have maybe up to, I would even say up to 50 employees with a limited budget. It's a first step to try to evaluate how am I going to allocate those resources. So that's just, you know, a little tip to go through that exercise.
Great, thank you. And Jessica, I think we wanted to also talk about leveling and the importance of it, and you know when to do it. And so I'd love to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about that.
Super. So one thing we've been talking a little bit is creating the foundation, and job leveling is very foundational to creating your pay ranges and everything. So when I talk about job leveling, this is sort of a process that defines and evaluates the knowledge and skills that are necessary for every single job. So, when you're thinking about that, you would be thinking, a junior engineer versus an intermediate engineer for a senior engineer. What knowledge and skills differs between those different levels? So nearly every organization through, at some point, through their organic growth is going to come to a point where they need to have a systematic structure. And leveling, it helps with this. It's foundational for compensation, for talent management. And when you do leveling right, it increases engagement by employees, increases in performance. It helps candidates understand and employees understand exactly what is needed for them. It helps them have ownership of their career, and it also builds trust in a total reward strategy. So it's definitely one of the foundations that you need when you're creating any your compensation structure. I think you're also asking, when is it time to incorporate levels? Well, you can't really start too late. Technically, when you look at pay equity legislation in Ontario, you should be starting to think about this by the time you reach your 10th employee. But it's more so when you start to think about levels, you need to think about your organization. So when organizations are starting to put those foundations, so levels, putting in pay bands, we start to ask questions about what is the culture of your organization? Do you want a flat organization, or is it going to be a little bit more hierarchical? What regions are you going to be operating in? This is going to have a huge impact on how many levels that you would have. And what type of work employees are doing in your jobs. But, sort of to, sum that up, when we look at the market, typically we see jobs that are grouped in different sort of career groups. So you'd see jobs that would be professional jobs, support jobs, and executive jobs. And within each of those, you'll have a number of different levels. But typically when you look at the market, you'd see core levels, around 6 core professional levels is often what we see. If you're looking at the professional, there'd be a number of management levels and maybe some support depending on the size of your organization. But it's really thinking about what the culture is of your organization, and will help you guide how many levels that you should have.
Thank you for that. Suzanne, I'm curious what the data and trends that you're seeing at Benchmark. So with respect to salaries and compensation models, are things changing in the last year with COVID, or have things stayed relatively stable? I'm curious to hear what you're seeing.
It's interesting because some of the information I'm going to give you is a bit anecdotal from talking to clients, because we're suddenly getting that survey data coming in now. So it's always a bit of a trickle effect getting some of it. What we're seeing is that 50% of our companies who are participating in our survey saying they're adapting to the remote work, and it will be different in the future. And they have no plan of going back to what it was before. And that's kind of shifting some of their compensation in terms of looking beyond my traditional boundaries. I'm going to go look elsewhere as well. So not only, so for those in the Kitchener-Waterloo, they're not looking just there, they're looking beyond Canada, because they're looking at recruiting across the country. And then 30% are actually looking internationally to try to bring those skills. I know you guys did another conversation all about bringing in those skills, but it is something that we're seeing as well. The turnover, it's interesting. Originally, we thought turnover was going to go down, and actually turnover is increasing a little bit more, because I think employees are looking up and going, where else can I go? I can move anywhere I want, and I can take any job I want right now. So we're seeing a bit of an increase in turnover. Salaries are not leveling off. Those key technical jobs are not leveling off. We're still seeing an increase in those salaries. And we're actually talking to organizations who said, we just can't keep up with what other organizations are doing, and are facing a lot of, we are now lagging the market by 12%. We're now lagging the market by, and they're all faced with these questions of what do we do? And trying to help that, a lot of it is going back to some management fundamentals. It is about pay drives performance, but it's not the only thing. Good employee engagement, communication, impact in the organization, employees feeling like they belong and they have career growth are still such an important part to make sure that employees stay and they're retained. Yes, pay is important, but there's still so much more. And I'm saying that as a comp consultant, so that's pretty rich, actually.
Thank you. Jessica or Kristin, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think that one thing just to keep in mind is, like, who's your competition, right? When you're looking at, hiring, retaining the people you have, and then hiring, new individuals. And I think that, a key point that was raised is, people can go, work from anywhere for the most part. I mean, there's some companies that are looking to go back to the office. So that can be a little more restrictive, but I think when you look at your competition, like a lot of US companies are not hiring in Canada because they can have their individuals be remote. They save 30% on their salaries. They have got, health benefits that exist in Canada. There's a lot of incentive for US companies to be hiring here. So, you're not just, if you have an employee that's based in Kitchener-Waterloo or Ottawa, or, a smaller city, it's not like you're safe because, it's only the companies that are in Ottawa or only the companies that are in Kitchener-Waterloo that are, we're competing against. No, you've got Toronto companies, you're competing against Vancouver-based companies and US-based companies as an example. So you've got to be really mindful of, to the point that was just raised, all the factors that are creating that stickiness. It can't just be compensation, because then you better constantly be paying top dollar because you're always at risk of somebody coming in and paying a little bit more.
I agree with all of these things that, I would echo Suzanne's comment. Really, often we see people are leaving. It's because of management or or job and career growth. So, I think, reiterating, I think, putting in those basics, those fundamentals so people know that there's career growth, making sure your managers can talk about the decisions that they make, making sure there's communication there for not only your total rewards, but any other programs that you have. That is a key element to, making sure employers are happy in the positions that they're in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that those are some key insights. So it sounds like although companies might be worried that they're not able to compete on the salary spectrum, that might not actually be the most important piece anyways, right? It's being able to put in some of these other basics. So I think that is encouraging news for companies that don't have huge salary dollars. If that isn't keeping people anyways, then maybe they can compete on some of those other elements. Kristin, I was wondering if we could just dig in for a few minutes. I know you mentioned compensation a little bit earlier in our conversation, but I think we had some questions come in advance of today's session, wanting to just understand some common best practices around sales compensation, commission versus base, and what are some best practices or trends that you're seeing in those areas specifically?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one is that you, first and foremost, if you're paying any type of commissions or bonuses, so any kind of variable pay, incentive pay, it's very, very important that, it's measured, like that it's realistic for someone to get to that number. And that, an employee understands what they need to do to get there. And then again, that when they do get there, that they're actually getting paid what you promised them. And then I think you also want to look at what's the behavior you're looking to drive? What is the specific role that you're hiring for? And then what's the behavior you're looking for that to drive within that role? So for example, traditionally best practices around hiring for what we call hunters, right? So new business developers, typically or traditionally compensation plan put together for a hunter would be what we call the 50-50 model. So 50% of their compensation is coming from base salary and the remaining 50% is coming from commissions. And highly recommend that those commissions are uncapped. You don't want someone to be like, oh, I hit this number and now I can sit back. You want to drive the behavior for them to continue to pursue past that quota or that number that you've set for them. From an account manager perspective, where somebody is managing an existing book of business, perhaps looking for opportunities within that book of business, growing that book of business, perhaps a little bit of new business development. And then typically we see an 80-20 model. So 80% of their compensation coming from base salary with 20% coming from, again, it can be structured on net new growth and existing growth. It depends on, again, all the different teams that you have and where kind of an account goes to. And then if you look at it as, what we refer to as a sales manager or director, again, depending on how large your business is, titles can obviously vary, but essentially someone who's a player coach. So you're expecting them to grow or build or manage a team, but also to be selling themselves. Then we typically see them having a base salary, commission for the sales that they close, and then a bonus based on, or commission based on their team and how their team's done. So you want to kind of reward them for kind of all aspects of what they do. And not be too, you got to be careful too in how, if most of the compensation is coming from them closing their own sale, well, then you're incenting for them to take deals away from their own team. So you've got to be really careful about how you structure that as well. And then if you're hiring somebody at a CRO level or, head of sales role, as an example, then, they're typically getting paid a very high base salary with some type of percentage on revenue that's generated that they're assisting in generating. And typically you'll see some equity because they're coming in and you're incenting them ideally to help you grow the business and get to a certain level and beyond. So those are really important factors to consider. It's also in how you position everything. Again, if you're very clear and articulate articulated everything from the beginning, and there's no ambiguity, then someone knows exactly what they're walking into. So maybe you say, listen, like we know that you're walking away from this book of business. So we're going to guarantee you commissions for the first 6 months so that it offsets your loss of commission income over these 6 months. So there's things that you can do and tweak there. Signing bonuses to offset things like that is also part of best practices. especially if you don't want to, let's say, for example, you have some cap on salary, but you really want, to find additional budget to hire somebody. Well, a signing bonus is a great way to do that because it's just a one-time thing and not for future. And again, that can offset some ramp up period for that individual. So those are, I would say, important best practices. And most importantly is, again, like really understanding what they're getting currently, what's important to them of what they're getting currently. Sometimes people get, insane benefit packages, and it really doesn't matter to them because their spouse also has an insane benefit package, so they can forego that. So it's really just understanding the key parts that are important to them, in addition to opportunity for growth and what future opportunities lie ahead of them, I think is also very appealing to the right person.
Thank you. That's helpful. I'll invite the audience if you have any further questions about sales compensation specifically to put them in the chat. One of the final things that I wanted to touch on was with the work from anywhere. We talked about being able to recruit people from anywhere. Are we seeing salaries level out across geographic locations, or what kind of data or trends are we seeing? I think typically you would envision Toronto companies paying more than smaller cities, but now that people can kind of go and work from anywhere, are we seeing a shift in salaries across geographies?
I think right now I don't have an answer because I haven't seen enough data to really give an idea. There's still geographic differences in the salaries as of a kind of a legacy of the pre-COVID, the pre-workaround. I know organizations are sometimes struggling when they have an employee, and this happened recently where they're saying, I'm moving out to Vancouver because I can, and you have to pay me more because the Vancouver pay scale or the regional variance that I know your company has. And organizations are kind of struggling going, do we do that? Do we not do that? Do we pay a regional variance because we want the person to move out there? Or do we say your salary is tied to your position in Ontario or in Ottawa or Kitchener-Waterloo or in Windsor? So a lot of companies are struggling with this one a little bit of what to do and how to account for any of those regional variances. Will there be a leveling off? There might be a little bit, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't see all of a sudden, salaries in Saskatchewan suddenly going through the roof and leveling off to the Toronto market. And I think it's a bit too early to tell with what we're getting in our data. But I think it's important because there's opportunities to go get some key employees that are not making as much as in markets that are a bit lower than they are right now in certain areas. And there's some key opportunities. And if you can get them, as we say, not only cash, but that value, that communication, because if we're all sitting at our kitchen table or we're all sitting at, in our bedrooms or our home office, that key to your management, the contribution, all of that is so important for employee retention.
I would agree. I think, I think it comes down to what you're looking to hire, right? Like, you don't want to compromise. If you have very, very specific niche skills that you're looking for, specific experience that you're looking for, then that's going to dictate a lot about what compensation is. If you're, looking for that person in Saskatchewan versus looking for that person in Toronto, yes, there's going to be a difference in compensation, but the candidate pool is also going to be significantly different. There's not a lot of tech SDRs in Saskatchewan. So, if it depends on really what you're looking for. And then again, you also have to be very mindful of what competition looks like. A lot of companies make the mistake in thinking, oh, we're a logistics company and we only have to worry about other logistic companies targeting our employees. No, there's business services, there's tech, there's everybody targeting your employees. So you have to really understand, if a tech company has a bigger budget than a small, business services company, like there's those factors weigh into it as well. But I think it really just comes down to the skill set and how much compromise you have within that skill set in terms of what you're going to pay and what that candidate pool looks like.
I think in general, when we look at the Canada data, there is some smaller differences when you look across Canada, but it's nothing compared to when you look in different regions and globally. So, it would be a completely different conversation if we were in the States or, if we were in the UK. The regional differences in Canada are much smaller compared to, if you're looking at Silicon Valley compared to, Midwest states. So, in Canada, we see smaller differences. So it's more likely that you're able to manage to a broader range versus having to have too many different scales for the different countries. In the US, you'd have much more issues.
Agree.
Thank you for your viewpoints on that. We did have one question come in from the audience, and I hope I'm representing this question well, but I think the person's looking for some advice on how to handle if decision makers within an organization are looking for the answer that they want when it comes to compensation. So looking at anecdotal evidence or common sense, and looking at benchmarks as being inaccurate, rather than looking for accurate competitive information. So I think what they're asking here is if decision makers around compensation aren't looking at accurate competitive data and they're looking at anecdotal evidence or common sense to make compensation decisions, how would you handle that?
I think often when you put some of the fundamentals in place, that helps. When you have levels, if you start to, and you can have a robust system with lots of pay structure, but when you're pulling in market data, if you know what the people should be at the different levels, and you match your jobs correctly to the surveys, that should help with some of the decisions. Often, people are looking at, the different data that you can get out there, and a lot of that's self-report. So, I often suggest not to go with some of the self-report data. Your best bet is to look at, something like a survey, the benchmarks or some of the other big surveys out there when you're trying to make decisions. But also there's the education piece. So having that conversation with leaders or the employees about what the difference is in the data and how you do things and how you create that structure should help. But it's when you have that structure, some of those conversations get a little bit easier.
I think going back to somebody's comment around transparency as well, right? If employees are understanding how you got to those decisions and what the different bases are and what kind of makes up those different levels or ranges, then that probably helps to clear up any ambiguity as well.
Yeah, I think it's,
Go ahead.
I think as far as transparency is really important. I've done a little research on that. You look, when people understand range, they know what their compensation and how it's done. It's more likely to drive results. But the thing is, there's that key piece is that communication. Is if employees don't understand or managers can't communicate it, is giving lots of transparency, can not be in your best interest. We want transparency, but if people can't explain it well, if you don't understand it, then you're losing a piece. So you've got to put the two of those together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And probably also managers across different areas of the organization all giving the same message versus interpreting it different ways, and then employees chatting between from different managers. We do have another question that's come in from the chat. So Sean is curious how the value proposition is framed around employee options. So they tend to be considered part of the total comp to justify lower salary, but are very hard to value due to opaqueness around valuation and number of shares issued. So is value estimated? And should full transparency be embraced? So our options, bonus and not comp. So just curious to hear from experts. And Sean, just, we are going to be running a session early in June on stock options and share options for employees specifically. So you might want to tune in for a more fulsome conversation on it.
I'll just answer in terms of the transparency. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about stock options in general when employees receive them, because I think they're getting about it from different, and even competitive market data. There's just a lot of chaos. There's a lot of information out there. So I think the first thing to get people to understand is, what is the option? How does it work? How does it get exercised? Is there actually a time where there's, what does it mean for me? What can it mean? Provide some, examples of what it looks like to receive. Let's say you're giving stock options, and, some people would get 1,000, some people get 20, but it depends on your structure, evaluation, and all of that. But what I would do is explain the process so people do understand what it means, when they can exercise, if they exercise. Is there a cash event? Is there not a cash event? Will there be a cash event? So people can try to start understanding. You don't necessarily have to be fully transparent, and often you won't be able to. You're going to be held by, all employees will not know everything. But the key is that they understand what it works and understand some examples of what it means if an employee, let's say, gets 150 options today, what it means in 4 years, how does the vesting work, how would you do it, and what are the potential payouts. So I think the more that they understand the process, the more they can put trust that it means something and it's not just something that the company is giving me to justify my lower base salary.
And I think just to add to that is, it's very important, like if you are joining an organization, this is an element of your compensation plan and a significant one that's, of interest or appealing, or payout's going to be, big for you at some point. It's very important that you do your own due diligence. Like, you should be speaking to a lawyer so that you really do understand and have, an expert explain to you all the pieces so that you go back with the right questions. And then therefore have the right comfort level in accepting that. But at the end of the day, there's an element of risk in any employment situation for a client, for the company, for a candidate. Compensation, especially if there's an incentive variable part of the compensation, there's, never 100% guarantee that you're going to get that unless you're just getting hired on base salary alone. So there's always going to be an element of risk, and it's important to just see what your comfort level is with that risk. The more due diligence you do up front, the more questions you ask up front, then you can make the decision, okay, I'm assuming this risk because I've done my due diligence and I feel comfortable with it.
The last part of Sean's question looks like he's curious whether stock options are considered a bonus, or whether they should be considered part of the overall compensation plan.
I wouldn't say they're bonus. Like, I think it's a significant part of their compensation. It just depends on like how the role's structured and what like percentage of it, but typically they're looking for someone to contribute a certain amount to then get a future reward. So it's a significant part of the compensation model, but it's not right away.
Yeah, stock options also can be used as in terms of hitting a milestone or bonus payment, or how stock options are allocated and how stock options are given. Basically, it's usually not sometimes people have a peanut butter model, everybody gets this, there's a range. As the company evolves, usually they don't do that. It's basically based on, critical skills, retention, achievement of performance, but you can allocate your stock options based on performance if you'd like. It's really up to your plan design. And that's when I talked about looking at, making sure that when you design that plan, allow from growth, flexibility, and sustainability, because you want to be able to make changes as your organization grows, because you're going to have to, and you don't want to lock yourself into something so tight that you have no way out.
Good advice. So if I'm a startup and I'm starting to put together a compensation plan, where would I go to get a good solid review that what I've put together is gonna scale with me? Like, how would I know I've done a good job of putting that?
Are you really asking a bunch of consultants?
Because I think a lot of companies put it together with the best interests of where they are right now and maybe don't know how to make sure that it's going to scale with them.
Yeah, I think do your due diligence, ask, right? Go to the experts, ask consultants, and it's worth a little bit of investment from that perspective to ensure that you set it up the right way.
Yeah.
We have a question for Jessica from Matthew. So specifically around job levels, he was curious about potential controls that a business can introduce when it comes to job leveling. So for some extra context, he's noticed job level creep in the past at some of the places he's been. So average job level of your role seems to increase and increase until everyone is being hired is viewed an expert.
Yep, I've definitely seen that before. But one of the best ways to deal with that is to have yourself a job evaluation system. So, you have, there's tools that you can purchase. You can make your own homegrown tools so that when you're trying to figure out what level level of job should be, you would put it through the tool, and you'd ask a number of questions that are important to the organization. Pay equity has the pay equity legislation has some guidance of different ones that need to be in there, but that will help you when making sure you don't get level creep where everything is becoming an expert. So that gives you a little bit of that foundation, and you can control some of those. And also part of it's also going to be your org design. What kind of job do we need? Like what levels do we need at the jobs? Sometimes what happens is, people get promoted because they're doing well, but it's, we also have to make sure that we're looking at what is the levels that we need to do the job. So I hope that helps. We also, levels often get tied to, job titles, and that can be a very sensitive topic in organizations. What different organizations do is very different. Some organizations have no titles, some have a lot of titles, but often it helps when you have some sort of titling going in line with your levels. But you may see something very different depending on the different job units. So often you may see sales maybe a little bit different with how they structure their titles than you would see for some corporate functions.
Thank you for that. So I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so we probably have a minute or two to take any last questions. So if you have any last burning questions around compensation, please put them into the chat now. And then I'll just ask our three panelists for some final thoughts. So if you could have companies walk away with one final thought on compensation today, what would it be?
I would just say that, it's important to understand the role that you're hiring for. So look at your budget, obviously, and then understand the role that you're hiring for and the specifics that you're looking for so that, you can adjust either the profile of what you're looking for based on what you can afford to pay, or you change what you can afford to pay for the specific skill set and experience that you're looking for. Make sure that there's transparency in how you set up that compensation, especially if there's a variable pay attached to it, that it's realistic, that it's achievable, and that it's, that your employees understand it. And, obviously think about the behavior that you're trying to drive. This obviously coming from a sales perspective, but think of the behavior that you're trying to drive. And so that you can set up the percentage differences between base and commissions accordingly.
I would just add to that. That was really well said. It's just when you collect your market data, get as many sources as you can. Don't just rely on one source, and go to the right source for the right kind of jobs, because sometimes a survey or where you're getting it may not apply to everybody else. So make sure, especially for sales jobs, go to where the expert sales data is. Go find that. Same thing for the tech jobs. There's lots of data out there. Try to collect as much as you can. I would say at least 2 data sources per job or per family. It's going to give you a different perspective. And then when you're looking at the data, really ask yourself, where is this data coming from? Is it reliable? Is it coming from organizations similar to me? Is the data being provided by the organization, or is the data being provided by employees into an algorithm and spitting up general summaries? So that would just be my view on market data. There's lots, go get it and go find as much as you can.
I think you guys have some great final thoughts. I think what I would say is to, compensation is one of the biggest expenditures for an organization. So making sure that people have trust in your total rewards structure is going to help use it as a something that you can use to help increase performance. So I think, making sure you have some sort of foundation, making sure you communicate it, making sure there's some transparency is going to help you get the, basically the best bang for your buck, not to, be too corny there, but it's that's really important, because if you're spending money, you want it to be motivating people.
Thank you. Such great advice from the three of you. We do have one final question that we'll get to before we wrap up. So from Katerina, she's looking for advice on striking a good balance between hiring new people that might be more qualified for a position versus keeping people that have been loyal to the company for a long time and happy, where perhaps they're hoping to get promoted. Any thoughts on that?
I honestly think this where is the trust and transparency in terms of having that tough communication with that person and trying to find the nugget that's going to keep them motivated and loyal to your employees, because those are the employees who are going to create that culture that you're probably going to want to retain. It's a tough one, but I really do think that no matter what kind of promotion, job, salary, that good management, solid communication, and building trust within your organization are going to take you a long way.
Any other thoughts from our panelists on that question?
I think Suzanne did a great job. That's exactly what I would have said.
Okay, awesome.
I agree. You got to look at retention and culture and the happiness, right? Like you don't want people coming in and getting paid a certain amount and then never getting anything again, and the new person coming in. So I think you have to look at kind of all aspects of it, but it's tough because obviously getting new people, and depending on what the market rate is, can reflect that in terms of the level that you need to pay. And that could be different than what it was a year ago or 2 years ago. But you want to proactively be looking at your existing employees' compensation plans and making sure that they're being paid fairly as well.
Actually, that's one good final thing I don't think we've touched on is how often should you do a review of what you have in place for compensation for current employees versus looking at plans for bringing on new employees?
Traditionally, I've seen, and I believe, annually, unless there's something like a promotion, or if an employee comes to you and decides to try to negotiate it. So, I mean, those are factors that can obviously change that time frame, but traditionally, I would say it's a year.
Great.
Annually.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, sorry.
The organization can bear, right? Like I would say same thing, unless there's a big event that's going on and you have to do a big shift, but yeah.
Great. Well, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank all three of you, Jessica, Kristin, and Suzanne, for being here today and sharing your knowledge. I know our companies appreciate it. So thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for joining. We hope to see you at a future AMA session. I hope everyone stays healthy, stays safe, and has a great week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.